All right, well, let's begin, shall we? Hello, everyone. My name is Sunny. I'm one of the PhD students here in the Religious Studies Department at Stanford University. Whether it's your first time or you've participated before, we want to welcome everyone yet again to the second of 5 Ptarmigan events taking place this academic year. The Ptarmigan series showcases a slate of distinguished scholars who discuss various themes related to late ancient studies, and this evening's program is definitely no exception to that. We've budgeted exactly 1 hour for this event, as with previous events, and we ask that you kindly do take advantage of the Q&A button that you could find at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. My colleague who oversees the series, Anu Jamin, will come in after the lecture to present those questions to our speaker. For today's program, we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Maria Doerfler, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University. Dr. Doerfler has been widely recognized for her contributions to the field of late antiquity and is the author of numerous publications, including her most recent award-winning monograph, Jephthah's Daughter, Sarah's Son, The Death of Children in Late Antiquity. Today, Dr. Doerfler will be speaking to us on teaching women and women teachers of the early Syriac Christian communities. And with that, I will go ahead and disappear. And I just want to thank you again, Dr. Doerfler, for your time this evening.
Thank you so much for this inordinately kind introduction, Sunny. Big thanks to Anuj for arranging this. Big thanks also to Michael and to all of you who are here and who are listening to this today. I want to begin with 2 caveats. The first one is that because we live in Zoom land, somewhere along the way you might see a cat wander across the screen. And if so, please feel encouraged to give more attention to the cat than to me. They tend to be more interesting. The second caveat is that I am someone who really loves a good script. And if you would like to see me demonstrate my impressive, at least second grade level reading skills, there's a lot of venues in which to do that. It didn't feel quite right for purposes of the Ptarmigan lectures here, an amazing series from which I've personally learned a lot already. So this is going to be a little bit more organic, which is to say that I'm going to be proceeding from notes and a PowerPoint. And while it's all timed and should leave us plenty of time for conversation thereafter, I also want to empower Anuj and Sunny and Michael, and indeed all of you here to physically throw yourself between me and my talking at you, should the need arise, and if I end up cutting too much into our Q&A time. With that being said, I am going to share my screen such that you might see my PowerPoint. All right. So my aim in today's talk is to begin at least a little bit to talk about 3 different binaries with which anyone who has spent even just a little time thinking about early Christianity ought to be exceedingly familiar. I'm going to orient each of these 3 around a picture, a painting, an icon, an image, with no particular connection to Syriac Christianity, and of course, with no prejudice to the people who have produced these, just because they help us illustrate something that I think is exceedingly familiar to many of us. The first of these is the binary between men as teachers and women as students. Most of you are already familiar with this in the context of the New Testament, 1 Timothy 2:12. I do not suffer a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Now, when we envision early Christian communities, if we think about women at all, we tend to think about them sitting quietly in the congregation as catechumens, or if they happen to be very elite, like Paula and Eustochium in the 17th century painting here, before Jerome, in a kind of private instruction. Never mind the fact that even by Jerome's own terms, this is already a misleading depiction. It nevertheless captures something about the popular imagination, even among scholars, myself included, when we think about early Christianity. The second binary that I want to draw our attention to is the sense that there is a certain clear separation between the roles of clergy and those of ascetics. Simply put, bishops sit in the churches and ascetics sit in the desert, or as the case may be, in the monastery. Their roles are at times said to be complementary, as is illustrated in this beautiful icon of Cyril and Methodius. Sometimes they're said to stand in rivalry vis-a-vis one another, but the roles are always sort of kept distinct. And this is the case even in instances when we have crossovers, like those unlucky ascetics that are being dragged by the hair from their solitary space in the desert and being ordained to become so-called monk bishops. In fact, the very reason that this category of monk bishops has attracted so much attention, including, I have to admit for myself, is that we typically tend to think of these categories as so very distinct. Now, finally, the distinction between Eve, that is to say, Adam's female counterpart, and the Virgin Mary, or if you will, between the consecrated virgins that image Mary and those ordinary, childbearing, family-having women who are said to be the image of Eve. We all remember Tertullian addressing himself to his female audience. You are the devil's gateway, you are the unsealer of that tree, you are the first forsaker of divine law, etc., etc. All to point out that every woman who is not among the consecrated virginal elite is indeed just another Eve. Now, as with many binaries, there are reasons that they exist in scholarship. And I've already begun to marshal the evidence for you, both visual and, of course, also textual. But I also think that Syriac Christianity can help us to complicate these binaries, at least a little bit. And my aim today is to introduce you to some of the persons and texts and ideas that assist us in doing so. I want to do this in the context of a group that is sufficiently mysterious that we're not even entirely certain how to parse its name. So before we go any further, allow me to introduce just a little bit of Syriac vocabulary. That is simply the term Benat Kiama. Now, the first of these terms is very easy to translate. Benat simply means daughters. The second one is a more troubling one for our purposes. The root here seems to be from the Syriac term word kum, which is to stand or to rise up. So we might hypothesize, for example, that we're here dealing with the standing or the upright daughters. Of course, it's not quite that simple, as anybody who has ever spent quality time with the Syriac dictionary knows, because kum also stands at the root of another Syriac word, kimfa. And if we think of this as a contract state, we might suspect that here we're dealing not with standing daughters or rising daughters, but with the daughters of that final uprising, that is to say, of the resurrection. The same word, however, also can refer to a standing agreement or a contract. So a third possibility here is, in fact, that we're dealing with daughters of the covenant. And as many of you will know, it is, in fact, in common parlance, the last of these translations that is commonly used. The second of these, the resurrection, is generally thought to be a really unlikely interpretation of this conjunction. I have made it small here rather than simply removing it from the screen, because as we'll see, even if this was not originally the intended meaning of the designation, in due course, the Benat Kiama, the daughters of the covenant, and their role in Syriac communities will have a lot to do precisely with the resurrection. And I promise that towards the end of our time together, we will in due course get there. Now, parsing the designation is difficult enough, but knowing about the identity and function of the Benat Kiama is, frankly, more challenging. There are no parallels for this office in more Western traditions. There is no treatise available to us to outline their function. And so what I'm going to try to do tonight is to engage in an element of bricolage. That is to say, assembling a mosaic from a variety of sources in order to try to give us traction on this group and their relationship to what it means for women to be taught and for women to teach. Now, in the process, I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour through many of Syriac Christianity's who is who of important dramatis personae. And my realization is that the last thing anybody wants to do, whether it's at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, or midnight, when observing one of these lectures, is to take really, really close notes on the sort of small source citations at the bottom of the screen. So I have taken the liberty of throwing together a miniature bibliography, and I've put this up on a website that I own and have totally not been using. So if after this talk you head to metristics.org, or as the case may be during this talk, if you're finding that it's not engaging you sufficiently, you will find a miniature bibliography that basically just tells you where to go if you want to read more of these texts, or whom to read if this is a topic that is ultimately fascinating for you. And I hope at least some of the latter is going to prevail. Okay. Now, our starting point, the earliest mention of the Menat Kiama, is in fact one of our earliest witnesses to the Syriac tradition, an author by the name of Afrahat, frequently also termed the Persian sage. Now, more so than most of our authors, Afrahat's identity is frankly obscure. We don't know anything about his background. We don't know about his rank in the community. Even the name Afrahat really shows up for the first time in the context of a 9th century manuscript. All that we know about him comes from his writings. 23 so-called demonstrations, that is to say, short treatises on a variety of subjects. For these, surprisingly, we have quite precise dates that help us to at least locate Afrahat's writings in the first half of the 4th century, and it also helped to locate them in the context of the Persian or the Sassanid Empire, that is to say, modern-day Iraq. Afrahat seems to have had a privileged relationship, not with the daughters of the covenant, the Benat Kiama, but with their male counterparts, the Bnei Kiama, the sons of the covenant. The 6th of his demonstration addresses itself to them, particularly on the topics of sexual purity and avoiding contact with women. There is one paragraph in this demonstration that addresses itself to the daughters. And in fact, on the next slide, I'm going to show you most of that paragraph. And as you'll see, it is mostly about what those daughters ought not to do. Let's take a brief look at it. You virgins who have betrothed yourselves to Christ, if a covenanter says to one of you, I will live with you and you will serve me, you should say to him, I am betrothed to a man of royalty, and I am serving him. If I leave his service and serve you, my betrothed will be angry with me and will write me a letter of divorce and send me away from his house. May you seek to be honored by me and I by you, so that harm will not come upon either you or me. Do not become inflamed with desire, or you will burn your garments. Now, this is a brief passage, but it gives us a number of starting points, a number of mosaic tiles, if you will, for beginning to reconstruct the lives and functions of the daughters of the covenant. The first of these pertains to living arrangements. Now, to be clear, Afrahat is mostly telling women how and with whom not to live. This argument that is being raised here should look extremely familiar to those of you who have spent quality time with the writings of, for example, John Chrysostom or Jerome, or in fact, even Augustine in the right context. Which is to say that, across the Roman and Sassanid worlds, Persians of all genders who did not conform to traditional arrangements of marriage because of their ascetic commitments nevertheless chose to live together in opposite-sex households. This is an extremely reasonable thing to do, frankly, because within the pre-modern world, particular functions and particular roles were ascribed to men and others to women, such that there could be a kind of complementary domestic arrangement. By the same token, however, across the Roman and the Persian world, Christian authorities resist these attempts, usually out of concern of compromising either the reputations that these ascetics, and then by extension Christianity more broadly, enjoys, or compromising the sexual purity of those who are involved in this. Al-Fahad is very much in this particular camp, and it is a very unexceptional thing within the context of early Christianity, broadly construed, to argue. Now, to be clear, Al-Fahad does not, in fact, tell us where the daughters of the covenant should be living. Luckily, we are going to get an assist from a slightly later writer, a man by the name of Rabula. Rabula is the 5th century bishop of Edessa, modern-day Urfa. He's an influential figure in many ways, and the very small dimension that I'm going to be pulling out for our purposes here is that of him as an ecclesiastical lawmaker. I'm going to show you a small quote from his Vita, a biography of him that was composed quite shortly after his own lifetime, in which the author asserts that Rabula's excellent commandments for the priests in the villages and the monasteries and for the sons and daughters of the covenant are too many to recount. Of course, as you might expect, our hagiographer then immediately goes on to recount some of those particular commandments. For our benefit too, we have a set of, and here I quote, commandments and admonitions for priests and covenanters that are ascribed to Rabula. Whether these rules, as I'm going to refer to them, that we have should actually be are actually the ones that Rabula's hagiographer here mentions isn't entirely clear. At a minimum, though, these were written relatively close to Rabula's actual lifetime and circulated under his name, invoking his authority for them. In these, we find two provisions that tell us a little bit more about potential living arrangements for covenanters. I'll show you both of these. The two passages, in fact, I think complement one another. First, the priests who are in charge of the daughters of the covenant may not allow them to reside with laypersons, but they may live either with their families or with each other. The second one goes as follows. The priests may not permit the daughters of the covenant to come to the church individually or to go out at night. If it is possible, they should dwell with one another. We see here, in other words, two options for living arrangements. The first one involving the daughters' families of origin, or the possibility of living in communities with one another. And in fact, it appears to be kind of this later solution, the living together in communities with other female covenanters, that draws to the fore in that context. Both of these arrangements are mirrored in later literature. In other words, when we see daughters of the covenant pop up in other literature, much of which you will encounter during the course of the next few minutes, we tend to see them in one or the other of these configurations. There's nevertheless a sense that the primary locus of social identification for female covenanters is going to come from the community of women. I want to show you just one small example of this, which comes to us from a burial hymn, a funerary chant for one of these daughters of the covenant. It probably comes to us from a slightly later century, although it is ascribed to a 4th century author. But suffice it to say, this has the community of daughters addressing their deceased member. And it goes as follows. Please, O Holy One, that is, of course, the deceased here, pray for our community from which you departed, which no longer delights in your love, nor rejoices in your steadfast presence. Our community remembers your vigils, your fasts, your prayers, and how much good you did all day. And it is saddened, grieves, cries, and sighs in the aftermath of this particular covenanter's death. What we see here is a life as a depiction of a life that is very deeply centered in that community and whose practices are shared and observed by the other members of that community. Another mosaic piece, however, that we're gathering already comes again from Arfahat. And this has to do with the actual reason for these living arrangements, namely the Daughters of the Covenant's commitment to perpetual virginity. This is fairly standard fare for women outside the laity in Christian circles from at least the 3rd century onward, not just in Syriac communities, but also in Greek and Latin-speaking ones. It becomes a point of contention in the context of the Sassanid, that is to say, the Persian Empire, whose leadership is very family-focused. Now, notice that this is also the case for the Roman Empire. For example, if we were to consult the legislation on marriage by the Emperor Augustus, we might find that it penalizes heavily those that refuse to marry, or for that matter, those that refuse to remarry. Over the course of the 4th century, however, with the increasing Christianization of the Roman Empire, and particularly, of course, with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to Christianity, there is a slight drawing back from the emphasis on marriage and children, creating a little bit of a space into which may step those who are committed to permanent virginity. I should probably mention that even though that's the case, we have plenty of evidence that in the Roman Empire as well, a woman's decision not to marry or have children remains controversial for many decades thereafter. In the Sassanid Empire, however, which of course Arfahat is located, there is more of a commitment to that good old-timey religion, which in this particular context means Zoroastrianism. In this context, adult unmarried women are looked on as even more unusual and even more anxiety-producing. We get a glimpse at this in the popular imagination in the context of these so-called Acts of the Persian Martyrs, a collection of hagiographical narratives that center persecuted Christians, including several Daughters of the Covenant, who resist being married off and as such face persecution. Today, I want to show you just a snippet of one of these, one that centers on a woman by the name of Tarbo. Tarbo is a Daughter of the Covenant and was arrested with her married sister, who was living in continence, and her servant, who was also a Daughter of the Covenant, and who had been instructed by Tarbo in the excellent teaching of Christ. What we see here is the beginnings of something of a trope, that is to say, a young, beautiful, virginal Daughter of the Covenant is arrested and is given a choice. She can either be killed or she can marry. Now, in the next slide, we're going to see Tarbo's response thereto. And as you'll notice, it really sort of centralizes virginity as an aspect of this particular commitment. Your filthy words make no impression on ears that are pure, and your foul proposition does not make any effect on my mind, which is chaste and holy. For I am the betrothed of Christ. In his name, I am preserving my virginity, and upon my hope in him, I am hanging my sure conviction. Tarbo's depiction of herself here allows us to deduce another point that is already implicit in Arfahat's account, but it is even more readily visible here, which is to say that the Benat Kema enjoy a privileged relationship with Christ and define themselves by virtue of that privileged relationship. This usually appears in the guise of one of the female covenanters referring to themselves as betrothed, as you can see here in the passage that we just looked at a moment ago. Betrothed in the sense that there is no consummation to that particular marriage in the present life. The consummation is only going to come either upon the death of a female covenanter or ultimately in the eschaton at the resurrection. We see this particularly clearly in a verse homily, a mimra on the death of a Bat Kema. And you're going to see here that our author is constructing a contrast between the grief of a young woman who dies while she is betrothed or engaged to a human husband, and one who dies as a virgin, betrothed to Christ. The mourning of death is near to those in their departures, but not the virgin who betrothed her soul to the faith of the cross. In the next world, a wedding banquet is being prepared for her so that she may proceed to become a bride, where death directs her. Her betrothed sent for her and guided her to be with him. Let no one weep for the pure woman, lest he be put to shame. The groom led her off, not a stranger. He took her by his hands. And who would dare to weep for the bride on her joyful day? In other words, the death of a woman who is engaged to a human husband is a terrible thing, worthy indeed of mourning, unless she is, of course, engaged to Christ, who with her death is simply trying to bring her to his and her own wedding feast. This brings us to the final mosaic tile that we can glean from Afahat's account. And in many regards, this is the most obvious one, namely that, as I've already noted, there are sons of the covenant as well as there are daughters. Now, while Afahat directs himself overwhelmingly towards male covenanters, later writings suggest that there is a kind of complementarity between the two offices, between the daughters on the one hand and the sons on the other. I want to show you a number of glimpses at this relationship. The first of these emerges from an account of what we might call the recruitment process for covenanters, as it appears in the writings of John of Ephesus, a 6th century West Syrian bishop. John is most famous as a historian, but he is also something of a hype man for the Syrian Orthodox tradition. In this capacity, he authors the so-called Lives of the Eastern Saints. That is to say, a collection of hagiographic narratives about Miaphysite heroes of the faith, and especially about ascetics. Among them, we encounter a person by the name of Simeon, the mountaineer. And as you might already deduce from the name, he is an eremite. That is to say, he is a solitary monastic living far beyond the cities, not just in the countryside, but indeed in the mountains. Of course, one of the things that one occasionally encounters when fleeing civilization is communities that are located precisely at the edges of civilization. And so Simeon happens upon just such a community of shepherds who are living with their family in a place that, shall we say, lacks an ecclesiastical infrastructure, and that also doesn't seem to miss it. There is a church, but there are no regular Eucharistic celebrations. There's no priest who might, in fact, be responsible for these celebrations. And the community simply accepts this as normal. Simeon, of course, immediately sets out to change this. He begins to hold Sunday gatherings, and he begins to, as one of his first tasks, to recruit covenanters, which he does by way of child abduction. In other words, Simeon, having familiarized himself with the community, promises the parents that if they send the children to the church with him, he is going to provide them with a special gift and a special blessing. The parents send the children. Simeon has them enter into the church and then locks the door. And here's what we see there. Simeon shut the doors and came up and separated and arranged the children with the help of the man who knew them, separating 1 out of every 3 boys, and the girls, moreover, on the same system. And he separated 30 of them and set them on one side, 18 boys and 12 girls. And he brought them up before the altar and shut the inner and outer doors and made a prayer over them. And the 2 adults began to taunt them, soothing them with kind words, and some of them wept and some of them were silent. And thus they shaved them, boys and girls alike. Now, because we're reading a hagiographic text here, you know that the next thing that's going to happen is going to be miraculous. Because when the parents attempt to reclaim their children, the ones that they successfully manage to reclaim die within the week. For the others, however, they remain and they undergo a process of joint instruction that looks as follows. For those children who had been tonsured, Simeon made tablets for writing, and he wrote for them. And thus he would thenceforth frequently sit with patients as a school and would teach them, boys and girls together. And they learned the Psalms and the scriptures. Now, this text provides us with, admitted highly hagiographically stylized insights into how a person might embark upon the vocation of being a son or daughter of the covenant. It suggests to us that there might be quite early designation for this particular office, and that thereafter there's a process of potentially joint education regardless of gender. The rules of Rabula once again provide a little bit more insight into the adult lives of covenanters. And once again, we see them as complementary. I'm not going to read the next slide in its entirety to you, but keep an eye on how these two offices are being presented in parallel. They're being presented in parallel in terms of the living arrangements for them, in terms of the interlocutors that they establish, and also, just as in John's hagiography, in the training. The sons of the covenant must learn the Psalms, and the daughters of the covenant also the hymns. Now, thus far, none of these texts have provided for us a rationale for the importance of the role, nor for the complementarity that seems to be set up here between women's and men's roles. For that, we need to look at another 6th century author, a man by the name of Jacob of Syriac. In many regards, Jacob is one of those dudes that does not, in fact, require an introduction. He is perhaps the second most famous Syriac author. He's enormously prolific, particularly as a writer of verse homilies, leaving us with hundreds of them, including, as I'm sure many of you know, hundreds that have not yet been translated into any modern language. One of these homilies, however, is an encomium of his great predecessor as a homilist and a hymnographer. And if Jacob is perhaps the second most famous Syriac author, the hymn that the homily that he is writing is dedicated to the most famous one, that is to say, Ephraim the Syrian, or as Jacob calls him, Holy Ma Ephraim. Now, the life and writings of Ephraim provide a lot of traction for such an encomium, for him celebrating Ephraim's contributions. And yet, Jacob focuses rather narrowly on what we might consider an unexpected aspect of Ephraim's vast labors. That is to say that Jacob credits him with being, in particularly, a teacher and a recruiter of women. As such, Jacob in this homily, in this memra, provides us with a rationale for why the institution of Benat Yama exists in the first place, as well as for its complementarity vis-a-vis a male office. In the following slide, you will see just a snippet of this verse homily in which Jacob is offering an ethepoeia for Ephraim. In other words, he is speaking in Ephraim's voice, drawing particularly on the image of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt and their safe coming through the waters, something that Jacob is going to emphasize applied to men and women alike. Not for the man alone did deliverance take place through the sea, that they alone should give praise to the one who delivered them. You women passed through the sea with your brothers and fathers. With them give praise in a loud voice for your deliverance. You witnessed terrors and wonders with your husbands. With them make a joyful sound to God Almighty with your hosannas. A single deliverance took place for both you and them from God. Let a single song of praise rise from your mouths. Gender does not matter when it comes, Jacob is arguing here, whether for the Israelites or for baptized Christians. Instead, salvation imposes a shared responsibility of thanksgiving on all genders, including women. This allows us to finally speak of what is perhaps our central subject tonight, namely the roles and the responsibilities of the daughters of the covenant. Beforehand, however, let me give you a lightning quick review about what we have thus far gleaned about their lives, which is to say, they live in virginity, poverty, in single-sex communities. If you dig a little deeper into Rabula's rules, you will see that there are certain dietary restrictions, no meat or alcohol, especially on the occasions of certain feasts, and the expectation that they be diligent in prayer. All this is why in scholarship they have often been termed a proto-monastic kind of movement. Now, this makes sense in its origins. It seems that the institution of the sons and the daughters of the covenant predates those other forms of organized monasticism in Syria. But it's also misleading. First, because these groups continue to exist alongside monastic communities for centuries. But more pressingly, while monasteries by and large focus on remaining separate from the cities, the churches, and to a significant extent, even from lay believers, covenanters are right there in the midst of things. The locus of activity for the Banat Kiamah are the churches and the martyria and the processionals through the city streets, all of which, of course, complicates this strict division between asceticism and a clerical function. It also, however, introduces us to an office that many of us do not think of when we think about the clergy in late antiquity, which is to say, the importance of song, or at least of chant. This is something that we have already seen in the context of the rules of Rabula. Once again, the sons of the covenant must learn the Psalms, and the daughters of the covenant must also learn hymns. Presumably, these do not just exist here for their private edification, but rather for being shared in the communities. This is something we also see in John of Ephesus and in Simeon, he of the child abductions. The fruit of all the instruction that he provides for these children is the following. From then on, loud choirs were to be heard at the service, choirs that, we infer, were being staffed by the sons and daughters of the covenant that had been recruited and trained by Simeon. A different glimpse for us comes from a burial hymn, from a daughter of the covenant, however. This is another epipoia, another effort to make a person speak rhetorically, in this case, the deceased herself. She is, and this is a very common conceit in Syriac funerary hymnography, she's speaking from her own funerary pyre to her community, and she describes her grief over having to leave her sisters. And as you read this or listen to this, just notice how deeply musically inflected all the language with which she describes both her life and the cessation thereof is. My voice was silent among you, and the sound of my voice from among your choir. Sudden death surprised me and took me from your assembly. It silenced my singing lyre and cut the strings of my psalter. From then on, death stripped the body of feeling, but it was still full of life, and its soul flew away, fleeing the habitation where she had stayed. The language of song and music, as lent to the experience of life, as something that infuses discussions of the role of the daughters of the covenant. This is perhaps also true for what is our most important witness to the importance of song for the Banat Kiamah, which comes to us from Jacob's homily on Holy Ma Ephraim. As I've already suggested, here Jacob credits Ephraim with being a teacher of women. He also credits him with being the creator of women choirs. Notice in this next passage how Jacob takes the Exodus motif that we have already seen in this context and carries it over here to describe Ephraim's activities. As Moses had given tambourines to the young girls, Ephraim composed hymns and gave them to the virgins. It pleased him, while standing among the sisters, to stir the pure women with melodies of praise. He was like an eagle perched among doves as he taught them a new song of praise with serene sound. Flocks of humble partridges encircled him, learning from him a sweet song with a pure melody. He taught the swallows to chirp and the church resounded with the pure voices of pious women. A related, if slightly similar version of Ephraim's life shows up in a hagiographical account of that life from about roughly the same era as Jacob's own work. And here we will see the reason why Ephraim allegedly created these choirs. Ephraim prepared troops for himself to do battle against these heresies, which we have previously mentioned. All the daughters of the covenant would come down regularly to the church. He established instruction for them and taught them hymns as well. Evenings and mornings they would gather in church before the liturgy and in the martyrion and for funeral processions, and they would sing. The reason why Ephraim is recruiting women to sing and to be part of these choirs is to combat heresies. Heretics, both Jacob and the anonymous author of the Vita maintain, and specifically heretics that rejected the holdings of the Council of Nicaea. In Ephraim's native Nisibis, that is to say in modern-day Turkey, were the first to actually make use of song to popularize their theologies. Ephraim counters this with his own music and his own choirs. And the scenes that are depicted here and in Jacob's Memra, of course, express perfectly something that I have told you at the beginning of our conversation I was hoping to undermine for you today, which is to say the binary between men as teachers and women as learners. Indeed, we see women surrounding Ephraim, sitting at Ephraim's feet as the great male instructor for women students. The interesting thing about the songs that are being taught, however, is that they are not just ornamental, but they're intended as instructions for lay Christians. Jacob captures this well in his Memra. Ephraim's instructions opened the closed mouths of the daughters of Eve. And behold, the gatherings of the glorious resound with their melodies. A new sight of women uttering the proclamations, and behold, they are called teachers among the congregations. The Syriac word that we see here for proclamations, the root being karosutha, is the same word as the Greek kerygma, that is to say the word for preaching and proclamation in teaching. In the same way, what you see in the last line here is the Syriac word for teacher, which is used for bishops and preachers, and is here given a feminine form and applied to the women choirs. This is an effort to subvert that original binary, with women being elevated to the role of teachers, not just in private settings, not just for other women, although we'll see in due course that there's evidence for their privileged role in this as well, but for entire communities. And this is our last mosaic tile for the night, which is to say, the role of the daughters as teachers of their communities. This is something that was controversial very clearly already in Jacob's day, that is to say in the 6th century. And we have every reason to suspect that Jacob's decision to yoke dysfunction of the daughters of the covenant to the enormous reputation that Ephraim already enjoyed in Jacob's own day is a reflection of his efforts to defend women's role in this process as part of the choirs, as part of the instructions for the community. Jacob marshals the quite proximate history of the tradition and its very big cheeses, including, of course, Ephraim, for this claim. But he also looks back further, connecting women's teaching with the incarnation and its establishment of a new kind of world order in which women not only can, but must speak in this capacity. Let me show you what this looks like. Your silent mouth, which your mother Eve closed, is now opened by Mary, your sister, to sing praise. The old woman, Eve, tied a cord of silence around your tongues. The Son of the Virgin loosed your bonds that you may sing out. The married one, that's Eve, put a muzzle of silence on your mouth, but the virgins opened the closed door of your tongues. Until now, your gender was brought low because of Eve. From now on, it is restored by Mary to sing Alleluia. Uncover your faces, to sing praise without shame, to the one who granted you freedom of speech by his birth. In the last line, you see her freedom of speech, and the Syriac word for this is one that transliterated should look very familiar to you, because it is a version of the Greek term paresia, that freedom of speech enjoyed by philosophers in front of kings and by prophets in front of both biblical rulers and, of course, the divine itself. Now, having said this, and having here sought to undermine one binary, I have at the same time marshaled evidence for yet another binary that I have originally told you I wanted to subvert, which is, of course, that division between Eve and Mary, very explicitly addressed here, and between the married laywomen, who are the disciples of the former, and the virginal covenanters, who follow the latter. Only one set of these, namely the Menat Kiama, can make their voices heard in the churches. The rest of the women must indeed remain silent. Now, I want to suggest to you that despite Jacob's strong claim here, this is a division that is less stark than it appears. We see this effacing of differences in practice, in the privileged relationship the daughters of the covenant enjoy with lay women. I'm just going to show you one brief glimpse of this, and it comes to us from a famous Syriac martyr narrative concerning a woman by the name of Febronia. Febronia is described as one who upholds the covenant. She is raised from childhood in a community of women where she learns to read and write, including reading and copying the scriptures. But she does not keep this to herself, nor does she just expend her training on her community, but she rather shares these gifts with other women. On Fridays, when all the sisters were gathered in the place of prayer, Brahim, the head of the community, used to tell Febronia to read the divine word to them. Because, however, young married women used to come to the place of prayer on Sundays and Fridays to hear the word of God, Brahim instructed Febronia to sit behind the curtain and read from there. In other words, there seems to be an activity that effaces the difference between the ascetics who are part of the community and the lay women who merely come out from the outside in order to hear Febronia. This establishes a bond between Febronia and the women of the community. And in fact, after her death as a martyr, the Martyr Act suggests that all the lay women were weeping, mourning the loss of their teacher. That last word here is a return to that feminine form of the Syriac malfono, the word for teacher. But this time it is not applied to a man instructing women or even to women choirs instructing all Christians, but to one of the Benat Kiama teaching women without regard for their ascetic or lay status. This is, in fact, as it should be, Syriac authors might argue, especially if we turn to that disfavored title for the Benat Kiama as the daughters of the resurrection. The resurrection, the last judgment, and the eschatological afterlife is an important topic for Syriac authors, as indeed it is for authors across all of early Christianity. We get a glimpse at what the Syriac Christian imagination of that resurrection might look like in a homily by Jacob of Syriac. I'm going to quote for you just a snippet here. Voices upon voices crowd around Christ from every side. The speaking of the gatherings and congregations which surround him, the voice of the nations who clap their hands to give praise, the voice of the handmaids grouped in choirs to make a joyful noise, the voice of the churches who sing praise with their harps, and the voice of the monasteries who make a joyful noise to him with all their alleluias, the voice of priests who consecrate him with the gentle waving of their hands, and the voice of saints who bless him in every place. The voice of men who sing praise with their respective languages, the voice of women who exalt him with their hymns, the voice of children who repeat before him. Then we have a lacuna in the manuscript. The voice of teachers who set their knowledge in array before him. For praise of the Father, the Son wakes all of creation. This is a symphony bringing together all voices, regardless of gender, age, training, etc., all in praise of the divine. In a sense, the Bnat Kiama in the present life, by singing already for their communities, provide a foretaste of that resurrection symphony. A reminder that this is going to be an all-comers concert in due course. In the present life, only a select few women can sing, praise, or instruct. But they point to a time when this will be the task, and indeed the joyful task, of all women and men and children. This is the context in which I'm going to suggest to you we should understand the conclusion of yet another funerary hymn, this one for a married wife and mother, a daughter of Eve, as the hymn very explicitly calls her. In its original setting, this is a hymn that likely would have been chanted by the choirs of the Daughters of the Covenant, accompanying the body of the deceased to her funeral. We don't need to cover the contents in any depth. There's a lot of recrimination, mostly ethnopoietic self-recrimination by the deceased for having given up her virginity in favor of that completely normal in Syriac Christianity as elsewhere task of becoming a wife and mother. But at the end of the hymn, that tension and that binary between the Blessed Virgins and the fallen daughters of Eve resolves itself by virtue of a petition to the divine. Lord, reunite the deceased wife and mother with the choirs of the chaste, in order to sing those psalms of praise to you, whom at all times the dead and the living must praise. In the eschaton, in the resurrection, in other words, those binaries will fall away, allowing for the full participation of all members. Now, Jacob's efforts notwithstanding, the presence of women teachers in Syriac Christian communities, which is already under threat in the 6th century, is going to gradually fade. First, we see a reduction of their office to chiefly funerary processions, a traditionally in antiquity very female-coded role. And by the first centuries of the 2nd millennium, they disappear with the title of Daughter of the Covenant devolving onto the wives of presbyters. And this, of course, even though in recent decades, that is to say in the context of the 20th and 21st centuries, women choirs are once again emerging across the Syrian Christian world. For our purposes, however, I want to just give you 2 small takeaways from today's remarks. The first one, well, I'd really like it to be this because I'm personally fairly allergic to binaries, but I'm going to try for a slightly softer and slightly more substantial conclusion, which is to say that historians work with binaries for a reason. They're frequently suggested to us by the texts and artifacts with which we work. But we should treat them as much as we can as a series of red flags waving at us, inviting us to complicate them further. The second takeaway I have for you is that history provides a resource for shaping the present. Not just shaping, but critiquing and interrogating that present. You saw this in Jacob's calling on the Exodus story, on the incarnation, on the figure of Ephraim, in order to defend the role of Bnat Kiama in his 6th century context. The same, however, that I have just said about the past can also be said about the future. For Syriac writers, the future, of course, has a very particular shape in the context of the resurrection. And some of what you see in these writings is an effort to allow that future to shape the present already. What I want to say next, however, and this is in fact my very last comment, I want to address specifically to those among you who are currently grad students. All of you are participating in present structures, in Syriac studies, in religious studies of the academy. But you also, I think, have visions for how to make all of these better. I know that the students with whom I'm privileged to work do. Those visions inspire me, they awe me, at times they completely freak me out, but they are, and you are, remaking the present by virtue of them, and that's amazing. In the process, I want to suggest to you, you are in fact also in some ways following into the footsteps of Ephraim and of Jacob, but of course also into the footsteps of those anonymous women in the choirs about whom they wrote. Thanks so much.
I always like to give a small round of applause after one of these presentations. I know it is eerily quiet on the other end as you're presenting, but do know we are all here with full attention on everything you're saying. So thank you for your kind comment at the end toward graduate students. I really appreciate that. That's very kind. Okay, so I know just a few minutes here, but I did have a few questions. And if we could at least answer one or two of them, I'd be really interested. And so one of them that I'm really kind of looking at here is that the life of the Daughters of the Covenant seem really interesting, right? They are parallel to this monastic lifestyle, but there seems to be a subtle separation between the monastic lifestyle and monasticism kind of as a concept and the Daughters of the Covenant. And so it makes me kind of think, is there some connection to maybe some, pre-Christian ideology here that maybe the Daughters of the Covenant are coming from? Is there something kind of pre-Christian to look at in terms of, ritual origin, kind of why they're there?
I really love this suggestion because, as you're rightly pointing out, we have the Daughters of the Covenant existing alongside other groups of women, some of them consecrated virgins in monasteries, some of them deaconesses, etc. And they seem to pop up so fully formed already at a point in time at which, we don't see that much of Syriac Christianity being fully formed. So I think the suggestion that, in fact, this role predates the advent of Christianity is absolutely tantalizing and tempting, and I really love it. On the other end of the spectrum, there's also recently been a suggestion that we're seeing reflections within the Quran, where the office of the Daughters of the Covenant possibly also extends itself beyond their lifetimes in Syriac Christianity in shaping Muslim interpretations and Muslim ways of speaking. So I would say, inasmuch as we're catching just a few glimpses along the way in the context of, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and slightly later centuries, the line peters out on both ends, but in ways that suggest to us that there's so much more there.
Yeah.
And I'm going to keep myself from rambling further, which I am so tempted to do. So
No. It's a pleasure. We do have time for just one more question that I have here. And someone just asked, your sources on these daughters kind of come from the West Syrian sources. Does this kind of look different in the East Syrian church?
Yeah, so we have, as you can tell, I have put together a smorgasbord of sources that I am pulling from. I'm not going to tell you that you have just seen everything that is available concerning the Daughters of the Covenant, but you kind of have seen everything that is available on the Daughters of the Covenant. There are additional martyr acts that we could bring into the conversation. I can probably point you to one or two more funerary hymns along the way, but this really is a composite, and as I think the question suggests, this might be a false composite. Our earliest evidence, as I've already suggested, comes to us from the East Syrian realm, and thereafter we see the blips, as you rightly note, primarily from the West. What that means in terms of the shape of the office in the different traditions and the ways in which different, both of course, geographic, to an extent linguistic, to an extent imperial context shape these. Again, these are questions that I would love to see more people working on.
Perfect. And I know there was only 2 questions, but we are at the end of our time today. So I did want to say thank you so much for your presentation tonight. And yes, thank you all for making the time to come out here.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such an honor.
All right. Bye, everyone.